Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 210 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. The medieval period is commonly thought to be a trigger-happy era, both in times of war and of peace. Although execution was frequently prescribed in the law books, medieval executioners were not kept as busy as we might imagine. When it came to the death penalty, communities were invested in both justice and fairness, which meant that unexpected things might sometimes happen at the gallows. This week, I spoke with Dr. Kenneth Duggan about medieval justice, executions, and the role of the gallows. Kenneth is a professor of history at Vancouver Island University and the author of countless articles, both academic and public, on medieval justice in England. He's also the winner of several prizes, including the Leonard Boyle Prize for Most Outstanding PhD Thesis, the David Yale Prize for an Outstanding Contribution to the History of Law in England and Wales, and the Pollard Prize for the Best Paper in any period of history after 500 AD, delivered by an early career researcher. Our conversation on when, why, and how a person might be given the death penalty, how communities were involved in the process, and why not everybody that you found at the gallows was executed there, is coming up right after this. Well, thank you for joining me, Kenneth, to talk about gallows. This is such an interesting subject, and I'm so happy to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So first of all, we're going to situate you in time and place so that we know what we're talking about, because laws are obviously different all over the place. So what is your specialty when it comes to legal stuff?
My specialty is 13th century England. Right. The best century.
No, that is the 14th, but we will agree to disagree on that one. So who's in charge? Who's at the top in the 13th century in England?
In England, you have the king, and it's really easy in my period because it really is just John, bad King John from Robin Hood. And then you have his son, Henry III, who reigns for a tremendously long time in the Middle Ages, 56 years. And then the Edward I, who's the grandson of King John, and he's the bad one from, I hate to reference the movie, but the Braveheart movie, Edward I in the Braveheart.
Yeah. I mean, I always reference Braveheart too, because it's hard to remember Edward, which one. But if you say it's Edward Longshanks, everyone's like, all right, we know who we're talking about.
Yeah. So those three, the king is at the top, and those are the three. Really easy to follow, usually.
Right. And this is why the 13th century is the best, right? Because it's simple.
Yeah. Fairly morally reprehensible people. I wouldn't say that's the reason why it's the best, but yes, I like the period. Not for them though.
Right. Oh, I'm just giving you a hard time. All right. So when we come to justice in the 13th century in England, there's actually two different strains of justice, right? Can you tell us about what justice looks like in the 13th century?
Yes. So really, you can really divide it into two and say, there's ecclesiastical and non-ecclesiastical in most ways. And so royal justice, and that's really the short answer. The long answer is there are a variety of ways that justice is maintained, that people are punished, people are policed and punished in the 13th century. And really, it comes down to how much control the government has in certain regions in England.
Yeah. Exactly. And when we're talking about ecclesiastical justice, we're talking about church justice. What crimes fall under that umbrella?
Well, interestingly, it isn't just what people might think, which is, say, someone being apprehended and then put in, for instance, a jail, because this is what will happen in the 13th century. You can have priests who commit wrongs. It can be even a homicide. And if they claim to be part of the clergy and it can be proven that they're part of the clergy, then a bishop or one of the bishop's agents will collect them, and they'll be brought essentially to be judged or tried as well in a bishop's court. But ultimately what will happen is they'll be put in jail. They won't be killed. Whereas if you're not an ecclesiastic and you're found guilty, you most likely will be killed. The thing that might surprise people is that in the 13th century, even though the churchmen are not supposed to be killing people or ordering people to be killed, they will still have courts and places where people will be hanged. It's just that the people who are hanged aren't churchmen.
Yes. And this is exactly what people were arguing about a century before. And it's still divided out into two different camps, right?
Yes.
So if you're an ordinary person on the street, what are crimes that you could get in trouble for in the Middle Ages? What falls under crimes, especially ones that might be capital crimes? What are you not supposed to do?
What you're not supposed to, so you're not supposed to kill anybody. You're not supposed to steal anything. Arson is a crime. Rape is a crime, but interestingly, it's not always punished as a crime because all crimes are supposed to be punished by death. Mm-hmm. For theft, it's if you steal something worth 12 pence or more in the 13th century. But that value changes as time goes on. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less.
And there is a bit of leniency. We're going to get into the process of justice in a minute, but there is leniency when there are extenuating circumstances.
There is, and sometimes it's the community that has control over the lenience, and other times it's the crown. Obviously, you do want to get a pardon for leniency if that can happen. But as I'm assuming we'll talk about, we will see that communities will have a great deal of control over the punishment of people, even if they've been tried, convicted, and on their way to the gallows, they can still be saved, as you will see.
Yes. And let's get into that. Let's talk about how the community is involved, because justice is not just the king ruling over one particular person who's maybe stolen a button right, from somewhere else. So let's go sort of from a crime from the beginning to the end. So you're a thief, for example. You break into a place and you start to steal stuff. Then what happens? Talk us through it.
So if I broke into a place and I stole something, essentially one of two things will happen. People will see me or they won't see me. Mm-hmm. If I get away with it, someone is still supposed to alert the authorities that a crime has happened. If they do see me, they'll alert the authorities right away. They'll scream, thief, thief, or help, or any number of words that they could scream. And then everyone is supposed to pursue that person. And we get the impression that the justices who are visiting and hearing about all of these criminal cases, that the justices are expecting everybody to do this. But the reality is very different. You find that by the 1240s, there's just a massive increase in the number of times where people who have stolen something and who are fleeing are not being pursued by people. And it might be because they're friends or family, or it might be because people have better things to do, or they might not care as much. It depends what's being stolen. And so If I was a thief and I ran away, if I wasn't discovered, someone still has to notify that a crime had occurred, and then they'll investigate. The community will investigate. And if I was found, then they raise the hue and cry and they will pursue me.
Right. So I was really hoping that you would mention the hue and cry, because this is something that people still say. They still use these words, hue and cry. And it is something that everybody in the community is supposed to be involved with. Like if you're in shouting distance, you're supposed to run to the aid of the person who is shouting for help. And you're supposed to chase down the bad guy, right?
Yes. And I've written something on this actually called the hue and cry in 13th century England. It's interesting because it is actually many things. So it isn't just, oh, help, help, or thief, thief. It's not just screaming out. Say I did steal something and then I fled and no one saw me, and it's a week later. A posse, for instance, could be assembled to come after me, and that would be called a hue and cry as well. Or, for instance, there are records in childbirth, for instance, where when a child's born, people will raise the hue and cry to notify that a child has been born. There are so many different instances in which someone would raise a hue and cry. But the one that people know about mostly is the help, help, or chase, or thief, or something. So you shout the hue or raise the hue and cry. Blow a horn, some people will say as well.
I had never heard of that being done in terms of childbirth. That's really interesting.
Yeah, there isn't a great deal of evidence for it in my period, but there is a small amount of evidence for it happening.
That is super cool. Okay, so everyone has run after the thief, run after you. Yep. They've apprehended you. Then what happens?
Well, if they've apprehended me with the stolen goods on me, I'm not going to last long, probably, because there are regions around England where lords have the right of something called infang thief. And that's the right to hang any thief caught with the stolen goods on them. And so if anyone caught me and I was in a region where there was a lord who had the right of infang thief, it would probably mean that I'd be brought back, and in a very short period of time, it could be that day or potentially a week later, but usually very quickly, I would be tried very summarily. It would just be a question of, did I steal something? Did I have it on me? If that's the case, I will be then hanged. And the difference between that and what would, I guess, normally happen is that justice often falls under the community or a lord. and they have the right to do that. Whereas usually you have to wait for the Crown's agents, the justices, to show up to hang somebody. And so this is an instance where they don't wait. I'm just executed.
So if you are not caught red-handed, but everyone suspects it's you, then what happens?
Then a couple of things could happen. Usually what would happen is I'm either brought back and put in jail, and then I would await until justices would visit. But what people will not want to do is keep me in jail. People as in the person guarding the jail or the sheriff or the constable, because escapes were punished very heavily. If I escaped in the south of England, it would be a £5 fee on the person controlling the jail. And if it was in the north of England, it would be an £8 fee. To put that in perspective very quickly, that would be the equivalent of 1,200 pence. And as is usually said for the 13th century, 1 penny is equivalent to 1 day's worth of food. So if I escaped, it would be 1,200 days worth of food for an adult. And that would be per person. And so you have jails that could be filled with people. And if there's a jailbreak, say there are 20 people who escape, it's 20 times £5 or 20 times £8 in the north of England. So sheriffs in particular are really keen to bail people as much as possible. So if I was apprehended, they would try to bail me to someone. If I was a thief, they would say, you have to find sureties who will guarantee you will appear at trial, and then they'll let me go until the justices show up.
Which is so familiar, and I think something that people wouldn't expect from the Middle Ages.
It is. And even if you go slightly earlier, you find in the 12th century, Henry II, who rules from 1154 to 1189, he has a tremendous amount of trouble with trying to control his sheriffs, it seems. And there will be an inquest of sheriffs where he's trying to determine, are sheriffs letting people go for money or for love, as they'll say? Are they being bribed? And one of the developments of the 12th century, or if not a development, something they're starting to enforce more, is that if you kill somebody, you really shouldn't be bailed because you don't have as many jails as people think. And jail isn't in most places what people think it would be, where, you go to a big castle and there's a jail. A lot of times a jail could actually be some fairly rudimentary structure, or sometimes people are said to be in custody in other people's homes. And we hear about that, incidentally, not because things go well. You always hear about it because the person in the person's home, the thief in the person's home, will kill the person who's watching them and then flee. So that's how we know people were kept there. But we find that by the 13th century, it's understood that if you've done something wrong, terribly wrong, like killed somebody, you need special permission to actually be able to leave on bail. And what's striking about that is that it really shows us, and the records show us, that jailers wanted to bail people as much as possible.
I mean, why not? It would keep you safe in your bed at night, right?
Yeah, or even if it was in a castle, they just wouldn't want it. The example I think is best suited for this is in 1292 in Lancashire. I think something like 9 people escape from one jail, and the cost of that, so £72, that's a tremendous amount of money in the 13th century. And you wouldn't want that. So you would try to bail people as often as possible. So if I was a thief and I was apprehended and I was brought back, I would probably be bailed. But what would determine whether or not I was bailed as well was if they could find people. And if I was, say, a foreigner, if I wasn't from that region, it would be harder to find people who would guarantee that I'd appear at trial. If I was from the locality, it would be very easy.
Yeah. Again, so the community is involved in this part too. They're lending surety to make sure that the person shows up for the trial date. Okay. So the justice comes by. How does the trial go? What's involved in it? Who's involved in it?
So this is interesting. There are, in the 13th century, there are a few ways that this would happen. The best records, or I should say the records I love most of all for looking at this, are called plea rolls. And these records show, for instance, something called an heir. EYRE, kind of like Jane Eyre. It irritates me whenever I want to look up stuff on the internet. It always comes up with not the 13th century heir, comes up with other terms. Anyways, the heir is essentially a judicial visitation. And so justices would come around the county, different counties of England, roughly in the 13th century, roughly every 4 to 7 years. And so that might seem like there is a great deal of time between when someone would be apprehended and someone would be tried. But there are a lot of other factors in this. So, for instance, there's something called jail delivery. And what this means is a person who has a jail that's particularly full could write to the central government and say, can you send out some justices? And then the justices will visit just to try the cases for the people who are in that particular jail. But the picture that we get most of all of justice is from the records of the heir, the judicial visitations. And so what would happen is about a month in advance, maybe, the central government will send out a letter to the sheriff informing people through the sheriff that they all have to appear at these certain times when the justices visit. And they'll send individual letters as well to the very important people in the region. And then what will happen is coroners have to show up and they have to have their records of everything. The jurors of the 100, so each shire or county is divided into hundreds or wapentakes, districts, if you will. And then each district has to write down what happened in their district. And then the sheriff has to also include, when he appears at the heir, he has to bring with him his record as well. So the justices show up and they have 3 different records of what's happened in that county. And if there's any error in any of the records, they penalize people for this, financially penalize them. And so when they show up, they get a great deal of information. And hopefully, if I was tried, if for instance, things are working as they should, I would show up for trial and I would be tried. But that's not what usually happens. I don't know if you want me to go into that, or most people flee.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if I was tried, it's quite likely I would be acquitted. Most people are acquitted. One of the main arguments behind this is that people don't want to execute people for certain things like theft, for instance. And so there is a high acquittal rating in the 13th century, but really the proportion of people who appear at trial is minimal. Mm-hmm. And when they appear at trial, they're almost always found to be not guilty. What's perhaps interesting about this system is that the jurors are on the jury not because they don't know what's happening or not because someone's going to provide evidence in front of the jurors. They're on the jury because they know what happened. So when the justices visit the locality or visit the county to determine, to hear and determine all of these cases, people from each district will be walking together and most likely talking about what happens as they're going. So they would know before they got to the trial what they were going to say and what was going to happen. So your fate is sealed well before the trial. And this is why we think, for instance, few people will show up.
Yeah. When
they do show up, it's really odd. There's a really interesting example where people show up and then they're found guilty and you wonder, why did you show up?
Yeah.
Because they get hanged. But a long-winded answer of saying this is, for instance, what would happen.
Well, I think it's essential to look at this. If we're going to, the word that comes to mind is if we're going to judge this time period, we should understand how the justice system actually works. So you have the community there. They are the jury. They know what's happened. And this really, I think, personally has an effect on some of the sentencing that comes down, because as you're saying, people are not trigger happy. They're not excited to execute people. So what are some of the other options that they have for some of the crimes that are happening?
So if they committed a crime, they have no other option. If you've committed a crime, you will be executed. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, it means that you will be hanged. Sometimes, for instance, in Kent, there are a couple examples of people being thrown off a cliff or buried in the beach. So when the tide comes in, you drown. Women sometimes will be burned. So a woman who kills her husband has technically committed petty treason. And so they will be burned. There's a debate over whether they were burned alive or not. I think most times they were not burned alive, but a woman would be burned. So that is obviously a massive spectacle in terms of what people think of punishment in the Middle Ages. And that doesn't happen as often as you would think, nor does hanging, even though it's the most common. But in terms of other punishments, say if it wasn't a crime, but it was still, say, a wrong, if you will. So say someone stole 3.5 pence, which isn't enough to be hanged for. You could have an ear cut off, for instance, or you could be beaten. There are some really interesting cases of this where someone, for instance, I was looking at something earlier today where someone stole an axe worth 3.5 pence. So he had his ear cut off. And if that was worth 12 pence, he would have been hanged. But there are other cases where someone does something similar. Well, they will steal something. And then, so say I steal something from you and it's worth 3.5 pence and you just beat me and then let me go. When that happens, the justices will then say, this isn't right. You can't just release someone and not punish them accordingly. And they'll say in some records in particular, so in Worcestershire in 1275, we know when this happens, the justices say, you should have cut off his ear or some other punishment. Mm-hmm. So there are punishments that are very physical, but unfortunately we don't hear about them as much because these sorts of records don't survive. So the royal records survive. So anytime someone's executed, especially if they have money, because the crown will take all their money when they're executed, if someone's executed, we have loads of records. But if someone's, say, has an ear cut off, we don't hear anything about it. No pun intended.
Yeah, I didn't see that coming, but yes, I think people,
I didn't either.
People get what we're talking about. Yeah, you could have something like the ear could be cut off or even slit, or you could be put in a pillory. And so people will see and know immediately that you've committed a misdemeanor and then
yes,
you're being punished for this. So even if you commit a crime that is a hanging crime, a lot of times the sentence is commuted to exile, right? And this is going to be important later, right?
Well, it depends. In some ways, it's not so much that the sentence is commuted, it's that people won't show up. And so if they don't show up, the justices will say, in the records, it says they're to be exacted and outlawed. What this actually means is they have to show up at the county court, at the next county court. And that happens every month. People in the Middle Ages, I think, were much more aware of what was going on in terms of how the law functioned than we are today, especially in Canada, where we both are. It's comical to think that most people in Canada probably have a better understanding of American law than they do Canadian law.
It's because of Law and Order.
It is because of Law and Order.
I love it. But it's true. It's true what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what usually happens for most people is they don't show up. And then the justices say, let them be exacted and outlawed. And that's what we see in the records. And what this means is they have to show up at the next county court. And if they don't, they'll be summoned 4 more times, meaning there will be 5 county courts in total. So they don't show up to the first, then they'll be exacted again, they'll be summoned again. And by the 5th county court, if they don't show up, so 5 months later, if they don't show up, then they will be outlawed. And that means that they do not have the protection of law and anyone can kill them at any point just if they see them. And interestingly, women are they're never put in law. So a woman was not technically able to be outlawed. They would say women were waived. The same consequence, you'll still be executed, but it's another form of othering. The system is very gendered in that way. Women weren't on juries either, for instance. And so although they're not appearing and you might see it as a punishment, some people say it isn't really a punishment. Some can say it's a failure of justice. Others say, no, it is a punishment because you're excluded from society if you're an outlaw. But that's really what is happening. If you were to say have 100 people who were to be tried, you would probably find that 80 to 85 of those 100 people would not appear at trial and would be exacted and outlawed. But if they did show up, they would be acquitted probably.
This is why Sherwood Forest is just full of outlaws, right?
It is.
All right. So I've brought you here to talk about Gallows. So let's get more specific now. We know that people are not being hanged like every day, every week, nothing like that. It's kind of a strange event in that it's relatively rare. When we're talking about gallows, where do you find them and what do they look like? Do they look like the trapdoor things that we see in the 19th century? What do they look like?
So they don't. They're not trapdoors. quite brutal, actually. It's a type of strangulation, really. So you're not falling to your death and falling and having your neck broken, say. You are quite literally being strung up, or maybe something underneath you kind of kicked away or pulled away, and you would die much slower than what we would think from what you see on TV where there's a trap door. And these gallows are not usually in urban centers or in communities in my period. This is the thing that shocks many people. These gallows, if you can imagine today, I wouldn't want to walk around where I live and just see people hanging on the gallows. Mm-hmm. And actually, people will complain about this. There is an example, for instance, in England in the 1270s, I believe, where a man complains to the justices or to the court saying, there's a gallows in front of my house. Can you please move it out of the city? I don't like seeing this. And so most gallows are actually outside of or away from where people live. And we get the impression that in the 13th century, especially, executions weren't very public affairs. Most executions weren't very public affairs. People didn't want to see other people be killed. And really good examples of this, for instance, are when people who are tasked with bringing convicted criminals to the gallows, when people go to the gallows, they'll do things, for instance, like allow them to escape. Or I think one of my favorite stories from Suffolk in 1286, this person named Reginald Dunch. He's captured, he's tried, he's convicted, he's being walked to the gallows, and he's being walked there by some people from the locality, so essentially villagers. And the villagers accidentally, in quotations, walk him through a churchyard, which means he can claim sanctuary. So they walk him through a churchyard, and he says, oh, look, a churchyard, sanctuary. And then he's in the church. And I can talk about that in a moment if you want. He's able to actually abjure the realm then, meaning leave the realm. And so just a good example of how communities, even when someone's supposed to be executed, will take them somewhere else. Sometimes they'll be allowed to escape. Other times, even when they are hanged, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to die. So just as I said, gallows aren't, for instance, places that people will visit frequently, or they don't want to see gallows. Also, people who are hanging others don't want to stay and watch it often. Or at least we have evidence of them not doing it on occasion. And the impression we get is that they wouldn't stay and watch it. And how we know this is there are cases, for instance, where people are hanged, and then the people who are tasked with doing this leave, and then someone from, say, a monastery will come and cut them down. So this happens in 1292 in Lancashire. There's a couple of really interesting entries in the plea roll for this, where one person is cut down by someone in the church, and then another person is cut down by a stranger walking past who sees someone hanging on the gallows. And they cut the person down, and then they flee to a church afterwards as well. So these were two people who were tried, convicted, hanged, and then people left. They were still alive later when those people were out of sight, and someone then cut them down. So they're not watching these executions. They don't want to see this, contrary to popular belief. Hopefully I'm not making people angry at TV now, or perhaps at me for being, dismissive of how things are portrayed.
If so, they've come to the wrong place, because, I mean, this is what we do. This is what we do here.
This is England, though. I should say, there are, like in other places, things are slightly different, but in England, this is how we see it.
Right. And yeah, it's important to make sure that we are making sure that we're situated in a time and place. But my search history is always odd, but I actually looked up how long it would take, because I was thinking about your article and people walking away. And I'm happy to report that if you look up hanging on Google, there will be something immediately that says, if you need help, call this number. So Google is keeping us all safe. But it takes about 5 or 6 minutes, which means two things I think that you're getting at, where people are leaving right away because they don't want to watch, or because they want someone to rescue the person. And also the fact that the gallows is so far out that it's easy to be out of sight very quickly, so that you could still rescue someone. So where are some of the places where you find a gallows? So you're saying they're not in the community, but some of them you found actually pretty far out, right?
They can be pretty far out. They can be at crossroads. Some places they're just outside, say, the walls for an urban center. But there's a debate, and this is the article you're talking about here, the ritualistic importance of gallows in 13th century England. There's a debate, really. I think it's not so much ongoing, it's just I don't think it's been settled, which is essentially over, do people have to be hanged on the gallows? And I think they do. There's a lot of evidence demonstrating that people who have the right to hang people, say if we go back to the story I mentioned of in Fang Thief, where if I'm a thief, I'm caught with the stolen goods on me, I would be tried and convicted and hanged very quickly if I was in the jurisdiction of someone who had the right of in Fang Thief. Well, we find that people who have these rights on occasion will use, say, an oak tree to do this. And when they do this, the justices penalize them for this, saying you cannot use an oak tree, you have to use a gallows. And then this leads to me, at the very least, an even more interesting question, which is, do people who have the right to hang people have the right to have gallows? And that's something I was trying to get into in that article as well, which is the justices, and the king in particular, is starting to, by the end of the 13th century, force people to show by what right they have a gallows. So the crown will say, yeah, I get it. You have the right to hang people, but you don't have the right to have the object on which people are to be hanged. And that and other things such as separate rights for gallows and in Fang Thief lead me to believe that you have to be hanged on a gallows and you have to have special permission to put up those gallows. But other people say, no, you could just hang them anywhere. And certainly there are people who will be hanged on gallows. It's whether or not you were legally allowed to do that or not. That's the question.
Right. Okay, so let's get into it. Why do you have to be hanged on a gallows? Why is it so important that it happens in this particular place?
Well, it's so important because in the 13th century, the crown is really trying to show that it has the control over who lives and who dies. Unless the crown gives permission to someone else to execute people, unless they say you have the right of in Fang Thief, you cannot kill somebody. And so the gallows is something the crown has control over. They're the only ones who can raise gallows or give permission to other people to raise gallows. And so by forcing people to execute others on the gallows, or by the crown executing people on gallows as well, they're demonstrating that this is a legitimate execution. This is illicit execution. And that means that people walking by will see that this person was a criminal. And so you're actually communicating to the community or strangers passing by that this was a permissible execution. This wasn't just some communal justice, or technically shouldn't be, but it is sometimes, as we can go into if you want.
Well, that is my next question. So when you have a symbol like this that suggests that everyone who you might find hanging on this gallows has been legally executed, it's not just something random, a revenge thing. Once you have this symbol in place, people start to use this symbol for their own devices. So what are some of the cases that you found where people start to use the gallows to make a point that was not meant to be made?
So I guess the two good examples are when royal officials do it and when, say, community members do it. So there are examples where, go back to me, I'm a thief, I'm in jail. Say I die in jail. There are examples of, for instance, people who are thieves, they're captured, they're in jail, but they die in jail, and the jailer wants to communicate to the wider world, if you will, that the person who died was a thief. Now, I haven't been tried and I haven't been convicted, but that person could take me, and this does happen sometimes, will take me to a gallows and hang me on a gallows as a way to try to say, look, this person was a thief, this person was a criminal. And when this happens, people get in trouble for this. So there's another example as well where a person who dies in a jail is rather young, and a churchman will come, take this person, bury this person in a churchyard, and then the sheriff comes back. I believe the sheriff in this case, it might have been the jailer, comes back, digs up the body, and hangs what is described as the stinking body. So the person was so bent on demonstrating to the wider community that this person was a criminal, that the body they took was already essentially decaying noticeably, and hung it on the gallows to try to communicate this. And so that's essentially the one type. The other type, which we find more frequently, is when community members execute people. So there are a variety of reasons for which someone could be executed. I didn't quite go into them, but say I'm a thief and I'm fleeing and I resist arrest. I could technically be killed. And one of the things the people who kill me might want to do is bring my body to the gallows as a way of saying, this person was a thief. We're trying to make this a legitimate execution by saying, look, the crown wasn't involved. There was no trial, but he's at the gallows. And so you're communicating that this is a legitimate execution. And this happens for people as well who are supposed to be, say, abjuring the realm, essentially being exiled, self-exiled from the realm, when they, say, depart from the road they're supposed to take, or if they just decide not to leave, people will execute them. Or, for instance, an outlaw as well. And you could bring that person to the gallows. And that's a way of communicating to everybody, hey, this person is a thief or is a killer or is a criminal, essentially.
Yeah, it has everything to do with, as you say in the article, reputation, right? So once you have somebody who's been placed at the gallows, it almost doesn't matter who puts them there, although the crown is trying to make sure that we're sorting out who belongs there and who doesn't. Because once you're there, you are labeled as a criminal, whether you've actually been found guilty or not, right?
Yes. And that the gallows are not in urban centers, that the gallows are actually outside of communities, makes it easier to do this. So if, say, as you see on TV, gallows were always in, say, some city center and in a village square, it would be very difficult to bring a dead body there or to execute someone at the gallows. I certainly, if I was being dragged somewhere in a village, I would probably be screaming for help or trying to do so. So you can imagine that people aren't going willingly if they're still alive. But because these are outside of villages and because these are outside of cities usually, it's much easier to use these gallows to try to legitimize extra legal killing, if you will, say a killing done by community members, than it would be if they were in urban centers, because there aren't people around. And some of the examples are rather grisly. So even if they behead people, so sometimes people are beheaded, it's mostly people who are executed by people who aren't royal officials. And it does seem to happen a lot in the north of England. No offense to the people in the north of England. In the 13th century in Northumberland, you find them saying it is the custom that we do this for certain people. But why I bring this up is there's a really interesting case from Surrey in 1235, where I remember the first time I read it, I was just trying to think, like, what's going on here? And it said a beheaded person was found hanged at the gallows. What's going on here? And what seems to have happened now, since I found this and looked into this more, is that some people would be beheaded and then they would hang them by their feet and leave the head at the gallows. And you might think that this is just ridiculous. But one of the things I point out in that article you referenced is that in Scotland, the legal treatise known as Regum Majestatum actually says if you kill, for instance, a thief who is resisting arrest, you need to show that it was a legitimate execution by bringing the head to the gallows and putting it on the gallows. And so you get a clear example of this in Scottish law, although in English law, they don't quite say it. And I think that's actually because in English law, the Crown is trying to prevent people from executing others themselves. If I can very quickly say the one perhaps very grisly aspect of this is when people will go out in a posse to find someone. So say I'm the thief again and I've evaded justice, but it's 2 months later and they find me in another village. They can come in a posse and kill me, but they're advised to cut off my head and give it to the coroner as a way of saying, this is an outlaw and here's his head. And we've done this. It's not something you see a lot of, but you see it enough, especially in coroners' rolls, few of which survive in the 13th century. You see it enough that it seems to be a practice. If you're executing an outlaw outside of your jurisdiction, you should give the head to the coroner, not put it on the gallows.
It sounds grisly, as you say, and it sounds very violent, but there are a few points I think we should really kind of come back around to. One being that these are all based on laws and ideas of justice, right? So these are all based on logic, and this all makes sense. And then this is actually pretty rare stuff that we're talking about, right?
Yeah. When I talk to some of my students about what's happening in England when people are being beheaded or how often it happens, people think that it's very common because, I'll give them a case or because it will be talked about. They think, oh, this must happen all the time. But actually it doesn't. And really a good way to think about it is, I don't want to see that, and I don't want to do that. And I would hazard to say that I probably don't know anybody who's ever beheaded anybody. Mm-hmm. And I probably don't know anybody who knows anybody who has ever seen it in that sense, even in person. And we see these things on TV a lot, and we get, inured to seeing these things. And so we assume, well, this must have happened. But you have to really hate somebody to do that. And so it's not that common. We do see it in the records, and we do see it more frequently, or I see it more frequently in the north of England. Though I should say there are other examples of this in places like, say, Suffolk as well. People will be beheaded there as well. But it's not as common. The most common way is to be hanged. That's how people are being executed.
Right. If you get caught, if you make it to trial,
yes.
And if you get found guilty, then eventually you're executed. But looking through it, it seems like, again, as you're saying, human to human, people are trying to give you every opportunity to get away with it if you can. Just don't do it again.
And oddly, so is the Crown, because one of the other ways that people will be punished, if you will, not so much punished, it's actually a form of mercy, is they can get to a church and claim sanctuary. And so if we go back to this case of Reginald Dunch in 1286, he's captured, tried, convicted, he's being brought to the gallows to be hanged, and the people bringing him to the gallows accidentally walk him through a churchyard, which means he can claim sanctuary. What does that mean? Well, in the 13th century, it didn't matter really what your crime was. You could run to a church and claim sanctuary. And if that's the case, you have 40 days to determine if you want to come to the king's justice, i.e. if you want to be apprehended and put in jail, or if you would like to abjure the realm, meaning if you'd like to self-exile yourself from the kingdom. Obviously, most people choose to abjure the realm, though not all. And so what this means is a lot of people, if given the opportunity, if they're fleeing, they will get into a church and they will claim sanctuary. And then the process is that they will be allowed, under the protection of the crown, to leave the kingdom. So as long as they confess to a coroner who has to show up, as long as they confess within 40 days to a coroner that they've committed a crime, theft, homicide, burglary, as long as they've confessed, they can then leave the kingdom under the king's protection. And so as long as they don't stray from the path to the port that they have to leave the kingdom from, usually they're sent to France, it seems, as long as they don't stray from the path or hide anywhere else or stay too long in one place, they'll be fine. If they do stray from the path, they will be executed. You can imagine, I always think it's kind of humorous if you can imagine you're, say, in Calais, and you see a boat come over, and it's just filled with people potentially dressed in white sackcloths who are going to be abjurers. You think, oh, great, here is a boat full of criminals from England coming over to France, into my place. Wonderful. Probably not something they would have liked. But it's an option that happens quite frequently. And there are some people that think abjurers always made it out. The really what I think when people abjure the realm, they're essentially just like outlaws. I don't think they're actually leaving the kingdom. They're moving somewhere else. Sometimes they'll try to escape from churches. One of the other parts of this process of sanctuary and abjuration is that once someone gets in a church, the church has to be guarded. Mm-hmm. And that means that if I say flee from a church, that means that village is now going to have to pay that £5 fee for my escape. And so people have a vested interest once you get in that church to keep you in that church, to make sure you abjure the realm. So I digress. It's when you think about this system, it really is few people coming to trial and a lot of opportunity for them to escape. And outlawry is, in a sense, a punishment in that people do lose all of their goods and they are excluded, identified and excluded from society. And abjuration, sanctuary and abjuration, is a form of mercy, if you will, where people can get to a church and abjure the realm, but they will lose all their goods as well. And it would be terrible if they did actually leave the kingdom. You can imagine moving somewhere, you might not even speak the same language as the people where you're moving to. But crucially, with sanctuary and abjuration, the crown is protecting those people. So even if, as is the case sometimes in, I think, 1286, in Wiltshire, one person is in jail or is in a church and people pull him out of the church and bring him to jail. And when the justices come there, they put that person back in the church so that he can then abjure the realm. So the crown is actually protecting these criminals if they get into sanctuary. So it's really bizarre when you think about it. They want to execute these people. They want to have the means to do it. You have to do it on gallows. They're controlling this system. But if you get into a church, then they, it seems, not bend over backwards, but they're doing as best they can of the job of ensuring that those people then leave peacefully. It's bizarre.
Well, I think there are a few lessons that we need to leave people with. One is, if you travel back in time, don't commit crimes. Two, if you do, make sure you have friends enough that will walk you through a graveyard, accidentally, a churchyard. Yep. And three, is always important to know your rights, no matter where you are living and what you're doing.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you so much, Ken, for coming on and talking about gallows and medieval justice. It's just been a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
To find out more about Kenneth's work, you can follow him on Twitter at KF Duggan, or find him via the History Department at Vancouver Island University at ah.viu.ca/history/faculty. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. So if you were living in Oxford and it was September 4th, 1269, you would experience a brief rain at midday and then southwesterly winds. It would go like that until well past the evening, but then at night, it would turn cold and gloom. We know this because it was a remarkable weather diary, and it's probably written by the famous scholar Roger Bacon. From September 1269 to the following March, he kept a loose record of the weather as part of a calendar of the movements of the moon and planets. And so I thought it was really, really interesting, really fascinating article that I came across talking about this and translating it. So you get all these little fascinating details from Roger about what the weather was like as he experienced it.
So does he talk about going outside in it, or he's just looking at it and writing it down?
So he'll say the night of January 6th, there was a lot of snow and a great frost. And there's a lovely bit on February 4th. He says, there was snow and rain and great cold and nasty, rotten weather for 2 or 3 hours.
Oh, yeah.
So I think he maybe went outside. He had to know what nasty and rotten weather was.
I mean, especially if you're in a monastery, you might really feel nasty and rotten weather in your bones, I think.
Yeah. So, it's probably the earliest one, at least from medieval Europe, that exists of a weather diary. So fascinating stuff. We have that. Plus, keeping with English weather, we have a post on this new book called Meteorological Disasters in Medieval Britain by Peter J. Brown. It's a look at extreme weather events. And I post about it because it's an open access book, which means you can download it for free. So we have all the details on how you can do that. And yeah, it's a really good read.
Awesome. I love open access because, so many of us are far away from the places where we need to be. So open access is just so awesome.
Yeah, more and more works, like a lot of articles and more books now are becoming open access. So thank you, publishers.
Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us all about the weather.
Have a sunny day.
Thank you, as always, to everyone who supports my podcast, as well as other indie podcasts and historians through medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons can access all sorts of great stuff like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of medievalist.net and this podcast. To get in on all the action, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Gallows to Tallow, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. You can even pre-order my new book, Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, which comes out October 3rd. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.